My name is Sloane Harper. I'm 36 years old. And at precisely 08:43 a.m. that morning, I walked into Hangar 12 with 50 pairs of eyes turning toward me, most of them filled with skepticism. A few with confusion, one pair with something colder than both silent fury. They belonged to my father. General Gregory Harper stood at the front of the room, arms crossed, boots planted like he was guarding a battle line. His chest bore 3 rows of ribbons. His face showed none of them. I stepped into that space not as his daughter, not as a soldier, not even as a guest. I was something worse in his eyes, an interruption, a risk, a mistake he thought he had buried years ago. The air inside the hangar was dry and tense. Engineers flanked both sides of the room, all in uniform or sharp suits. In the center, veiled by a heavy tarp, sat the Spectre X, the most advanced hybrid stealth helicopter the U.S. military had ever attempted to put into combat. Only it wasn't flying. It had failed again. And again. 49 experts had tried to fix it. All had failed. I wasn't number 50. I wasn't even on the list. I barely had time to breathe before a soldier stepped in front of me, young, rigid, nervous. "Ma'am, I need to see your clearance." He wasn't the problem. Behind him, my father nodded once sharply. "She has no clearance," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. "Escort her out." I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I had known it would come to this, but hearing it out loud from him in front of that room, it still cut like frost. The soldier looked at me uncertain. I could feel the room waiting like it was holding its breath, trying to figure out who I was and what the hell I thought I was doing there. And then he said it. My father, who hadn't spoken my name in 4 years, who hadn't answered a single one of my letters since the day I was removed from the Spectre X project. He said, "You've wasted enough of our time. This isn't for you anymore." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. I heard the message underneath. This was his room, his project, his reputation, and I was the blueprint he wanted erased. The next sound came not from him, but from behind me. A pair of boots echoing on the concrete. They didn't rush. They didn't hesitate. Every head turned as General Aldridge entered the hangar from the side corridor, flanked by silence. He was taller than I remembered, or maybe just heavier with time. The room shifted instantly. Some stood straighter, others swallowed hard. He didn't look at my father. He walked past the young soldier, past the rows of engineers and technicians, and stopped right in front of me. Then, without a trace of hesitation, he turned to the room and said, "She drafted the blueprint. She leads now." I don't remember a sound for 5 seconds. Then something dropped. A metal tool clinked against the floor. Somewhere to my right, someone whispered, "She's the one." The same engineer who had insisted in a meeting 2 years ago that I was too theoretical to lead field innovation. I didn't look back at him. I looked forward. At my father. He hadn't moved. His arms still crossed, but his grip was tighter now. The skin on his knuckles pale. His lips were thin, pressed together like someone trying not to choke. The room went pale. I had imagined this moment so many times I'd lost count. But never like this. Never with a general pointing to me declaring the truth like a court verdict. Never with so many people standing still, unsure whether to applaud, to obey, or to apologize. And never with my father. The man who once said I was too soft for combat tech, too emotional for strategy, too naive for leadership. Watching me take back the very thing he had taken away. He didn't say a word. Not when Aldridge handed me the mission file. Not when the team leads were instructed to report to me. Not even when I walked past him and unzipped the tarp covering the failed Spectre X. I ran my fingers across the side panel. It was still warm, still waiting. I turned to the room. "Let's start," I said. And for the first time in years, they listened. I was born in a house with maps on every wall and silence in every hallway. My father was a soldier long before he was a father, and even longer before he ever tried to be human. I say tried because I don't think he ever truly wanted to be anything other than what the uniform allowed him to be: disciplined, distant, and feared. My mother died when I was 9. Ovarian cancer. By the time they caught it, it had already moved to her spine. She went quietly, like everything she did. I don't remember the last thing she said to me, but I remember what she said to him. Please don't make her earn love. He never responded. After she passed, the house got colder. Not because we couldn't afford heat. God knows a 4-star general has plenty, but because warmth became irrelevant. We lived in the same house, but in different time zones. He rose before sunrise, trained before coffee, and rarely spoke more than 10 words a day. I tried to follow the rules, not because I feared punishment, but because I craved approval. My way in was through excellence. Math came first, then physics, then programming. I won regional science fairs, broke state records in calculus competitions, and was the only girl in my high school to pass the Air Force Academy's pre-admission exam before graduation. He never showed up to a single award ceremony. Once in my junior year, I left a handwritten certificate from a robotics competition on the kitchen table, just to see if he'd acknowledge it. That night it was gone, not a word said, not a glance exchanged. The only thing he ever gave me consistently was a single sentence. He never shouted it, he never explained it. He just said it over and over until it sank in like marrow into bone. Don't be good, be right. It was his creed, his compass, his shield. It took me years to realize that being right to him didn't mean ethical. It didn't mean just or kind or curious. It meant being exact, unquestionable, unemotional. Feelings were failure, questions were weakness, and God forbid you ever cried. Once in 6th grade, I brought home a B+ on a pop quiz, 1 question off. I cried. Not because of the grade, but because I thought he'd be disappointed. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't touch me, he just looked at the paper, then at me, and said, "Emotion won't change the answer." Then he walked away. There was no room for mistakes in his house, no room for vulnerability, and definitely no room for daughters who wanted anything other than to replicate his standards perfectly. The older I got, the more I realized that I didn't scare him, I confused him, because I was good. But I wasn't cold, because I could code an aircraft logic tree blindfolded, but still cried when the family dog died. Because I asked why we had to use one propulsion algorithm over another when everyone else just executed. He didn't know what to do with that, so he ignored it. He taught me how to shoot, how to calculate wind speed by feel, and how to read topographical maps in the dark. But he never asked about my dreams, never asked if I wanted to be a pilot, or a scientist, or a leader. The truth is, I don't think he ever planned for me at all. I was a daughter in his house, not in his plans. And it wasn't until much later, long after I left the academy, long after I joined the engineering corps, and long after I was placed on the Spectre X prototype team, that I realized he never saw me as a mistake. He saw me as a threat, not to his rank, not to his title, but to the order he had built. The belief that only one kind of excellence mattered. And I was not that kind, not then, not yet. But I would be, and he would live to see it. My father remarried when I was 28. The ceremony was private, no church, no family beyond a few uniformed colleagues and 2 civilians. I wasn't invited. I heard about it from a colleague at the Defense Research Division who asked if I'd be attending. I said I had work to do. Her name was Dr. Evelyn Trent, a civilian aerospace analyst who had consulted on long-range radar arrays and electromagnetic stealth technology. Sharp, polished, well-spoken, everything my father respected in a professional. I met her twice before they married, once at a Pentagon briefing, the second time briefly in the hallway outside his office. She nodded. I saluted. He didn't introduce us. She had a son, Peter Trent, a few years younger than me, aerospace engineer, West Point grad, master's from MIT. On paper, he was exceptional. In person, he was fine, polite, confident, the kind of man who always knew someone in the room and made sure you knew he knew them. Peter and I were placed on the same working group when the Spectre X hybrid helicopter project began its earliest feasibility stages. The goal was to build a low-noise, heat-reducing combat aircraft capable of evading modern detection across infrared sonar and magnetic fields. It was ambitious, nearly impossible, which was why I loved it. I helped sketch out the preliminary model for the thermal balancing system using a variable mesh algorithm I'd been building since my second year in grad school. It wasn't elegant yet, but it worked. Peter, meanwhile, focused on the propulsion routing. He was sharp with numbers, faster than me with simulation output, but careless with assumptions. We debated, often quietly, respectfully, but with increasing friction. One afternoon during a closed-door meeting, I challenged a pressure calibration he proposed. He smiled, raised both hands, and said, "You might be right, Sloan. Or maybe you just like making theory sound like gospel." Some people laughed. I didn't. Neither did the test model. My warning turned out valid. The routing failed during the next diagnostic. Still a week later, Peter was promoted to lead interface integrator. I was pulled off the core team and reassigned to data redundancy modeling 2 levels below, where I'd started. No explanation, no review, no warning. I wasn't angry. I was confused. Until I opened the internal evaluation log by accident, while cross-referencing versioning notes on a shared server. The file wasn't labeled with names, just project codes, but the comment stood out in red, tagged with my ID number and a familiar 3-initial reviewer code, GH. The note read, "Strong theoretical capacity, but application remains too narrow. Tendency to isolate. Lacks team adaptability. Recommend rotation out of central design. Not suitable for current operational phase." And then below it, one more line, an addendum added a few days later, "Theory heavy. Not aligned with dynamic execution requirements." My father had signed off on my removal, not just as a general, as my superior. And Peter? He stayed. He led. He became the boss of Spectre X development in every internal memo and briefing deck. I showed up to the lab the next day, cleared out my desk, and said nothing. I didn't fight, didn't protest. I simply left. That evening, I drove home in silence, the city lights flickering through my windshield like errors on a faulty console. I knew then this wasn't about merit. This was about replacement. My father had never called Peter son. Not in public, at least. But in every meeting, every hallway nod, every closed-door promotion, he made his preference clear. He had chosen. And it wasn't me. Not because I wasn't good enough, but because I was inconvenient. I didn't ask for favors. I didn't play politics. I didn't fit the order of his new life, his new family, his new hierarchy. That was the day I stopped believing in fairness. But it was also the day I started believing in myself quietly, stubbornly, completely. If I couldn't have their permission to lead, I would earn their regret. And eventually I did. The Spectre X was beautiful on paper. Sleek composite frame, hybrid turbine electromagnetic engine, full stealth modulation, and a theoretical zero detection window of 28 minutes in high threat zones. It was everything a next-generation combat chopper was meant to be. But like most beautiful things in theory, it didn't breathe right in reality. In the first 6 months of development, my focus was the thermal regulation subsystem, the part most people overlooked. Everyone wanted to talk propulsion lift, efficiency, noise cancellation. I cared about heat, the one thing you can't cheat in physics. The Spectre X was designed to run whisper quiet and invisible. But running quiet meant pushing certain subsystems beyond standard tolerances. The heat generated inside the central rotor housing exceeded 70 degrees Celsius, under full output in controlled simulations. That was too high. I noticed it during a diagnostic loop late one night. A harmonic pulse barely noticeable appeared once every 11.2 seconds. At first I thought it was noise. Then I matched it to the rotor synchronization rate. It wasn't noise, it was a vibration, micro-rhythmic and increasing in amplitude with each thermal cycle. I ran it through 3 separate software environments. Same pattern. The data told me that once the internal temperature passed 70 degrees, the mounting structure holding the hybrid drive and magnetic dampeners would begin to flex at micro levels. That flexing would distort rotational symmetry. That distortion would spike the thermal load. And that would cause a cascading feedback loop. In simple terms, the Spectre X had a heartbeat, and if it got too warm, it would code out. I wrote the memo that night. 8 pages, charts, graphs, recorded logs. I titled it Thermal Pulse Oscillation Risk Category, Yellow Escalating. I submitted it directly to the system's risk inbox, copied engineering command, flagged the lead design coordinator. Then I waited. 3 days passed. Nothing. A week later, I got a response. From Peter, appreciate the thoroughness, Sloan. We've reviewed it. No replication of issue on our end. Your approach may be too theoretical for application-level planning. Let's keep this thread internal. No need to raise alarm, no follow-up, no call from QA, no second look. The memo disappeared. So did any trace of my original diagnostics. When I logged into the system a week later, I found my user access downgraded. The following Monday, I was called into a meeting with the deputy admin. No explanation, no performance concern, just a routine reassignment. Effective immediately. I wasn't angry, I wasn't shocked. I was quiet. I boxed my notes, deleted my local files, took one last look at the rotating display model of Spectre X on the lab wall and thought, if that heartbeat grows, someone's going to crash. I went home that night and printed the original memo, slipped it into a folder, marked the date, not because I wanted revenge, but because I couldn't let them erase what I saw. The helicopter was breathing too hard, and no one wanted to listen to its rhythm but me. So I kept listening, from a distance, from silence, from the sidelines they forced me into. And in that silence, I started to build something else. A blueprint they couldn't touch. A version only I knew existed. Because even when they erased me from the project, they didn't erase the warning. They just chose not to hear it. And one day they'd regret that silence. 2 weeks after I was reassigned, Peter was named Technical Liaison for Spectre X Phase 2. His face appeared on the cover slide of every internal presentation. His name was listed first on all the updated documents, even those I had originally written. The lab chatter shifted. He wasn't just part of the project anymore, he was the face of it. They called him Trent, not Peter, as if that made his achievements sound more clinical, more earned. He adopted the language quickly, metric stakeholders, vertical optimization. He didn't talk about the heat issue. He didn't have to. That conversation had been buried with my name on it. What hurt wasn't that he got credit. It was that he got permission. Permission to lead, to fail, to experiment, to be visible. I had outscored him in every practical simulation. I'd published 3 peer-reviewed articles on hybrid thermal loads before he even finished his thesis. And yet he was the one standing in front of the generals while I was filing subsystem redundancies in a basement room with no windows. I kept working, quietly, precisely. I didn't ask to be reinstated. I didn't knock on doors. I already knew how the hallway ended. Then came the announcement. Spectre X Phase 2 would be unveiled at the Strategic Aerospace Systems Summit. It was a closed-door event, classified briefings only held annually at an off-site base in Nevada. Everyone who had contributed to the project in the past year would be present. Everyone except me. I didn't receive an invitation, no memo, no mention. But I saw the press photo the next morning. A clean stage. The Spectre X prototype behind velvet ropes. Peter in a sharp black suit standing to the right of the display, smiling like he'd built it himself. And beside him my father, General Harper, looking proud, looking comfortable, looking like he had finally found the version of a child he could present to the world. I stared at that photo for a long time. My coffee went cold. My hands didn't move. It wasn't just that I had been erased. It was that I had been replaced so effortlessly. That night I returned to the office to collect my things. No one was there. I didn't turn on the lights. I moved quietly the way forgotten people do. I took the original draft of my memo, still printed, folded, labeled by hand. I opened my drawer and pulled out the blueprint I had started months earlier. My version, the one no one asked for. the one that fixed the thing they didn't want to admit was broken. It wasn't finished yet, but it would be. Not for them. For me. As I stepped outside, the air felt sharper. Colder, the kind of cold that doesn't numb, it clarifies. I didn't cry. I didn't curse. I didn't promise revenge. I just knew I was done waiting to be seen. They had chosen Peter. My father had chosen Peter. But the machine, the system, the specter, it didn't care about legacy. It only cared about truth. And truth has a way of coming back, especially when it's been ignored. So I walked out of that building, blueprint in hand, memo in my bag, and a new kind of silence in my chest. Not the silence of rejection, the silence of resolve. They thought I disappeared, but I hadn't vanished. I was just stepping out of their shadow so I could build something they couldn't touch. In the spring of 2023, Spectre X was scheduled for its first major demonstration outside of controlled environments. The Department of Defense had selected Fort Ravenshade, a classified test base in Nevada, as the site for a live fly presentation and exclusive briefing for senior military leaders, top congressional defense staffers, and selected NATO liaisons. The stakes weren't just high, they were existential. Billions of dollars in investment, years of theoretical engineering, dozens of careers built or broken on this project's success. I wasn't there, of course. I learned about it weeks after the invitation list had been finalized. Peter was set to lead the technical overview. My father would deliver the closing remarks. A joint appearance, strategic optics. The Golden Boy and the Iron General. I watched the test on a private internal feed. I still had access to one encrypted channel, a leftover from my system's audit clearance. I knew it would be wiped eventually, but for now, I held onto it like a live wire. The demonstration began at 07:00 sharp. The Spectre X lifted off cleanly. Smooth acceleration. Noise levels stayed below 32 decibels, nearly imperceptible, even to tactical listening arrays. The magnetic shielding engaged properly. It flew like a ghost across the desert skyline, hugging terrain with an elegance I once dreamed of designing. But dreams have a strange way of returning as warnings, and I had already seen what would happen. At minute 16, I noticed a flutter in the feed's telemetry, a microsecond hiccup in the rotor speed feedback. Barely noticeable unless you were watching for it. I was. At 17 minutes and 12 seconds, the anomaly magnified. The hybrid drive stalled, the rotor drag increased, and then the thermal feedback loop snapped shut. Spectre X lost full engine response. Dead in the air. The emergency pilot disengaged all assistive systems and triggered fallback descent mode. The helicopter tilted sharply, dropped 42 feet in less than 5 seconds, and barely stabilized enough to land hard, but safe on the far edge of the landing zone. No explosion, no fire, but also no success. The feed cut almost immediately, then silence. No official report came out that day, no footage released to the press. The only headline I saw was a brief in a defense blog, minor setback in stealth rotorcraft demo. DoD withholds comments. But inside the walls of that hangar and inside the rooms where decisions are made behind 10 layers of clearance, panic had already erupted. The NATO observers returned to Brussels unimpressed. The congressional staffers canceled follow-up briefings, and the Department of Defense issued a formal inquiry into systems instability related to electromagnetic thermal loading, a phrase so carefully written it barely sounded like the fire alarm it was. But I knew. They had walked straight into the failure I warned them about. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt sick. Because I hadn't predicted the failure, I had documented it. I had written it down, flagged it, escalated it, and begged them to look. And they buried it. I spent that night rewatching the clipped footage, frame by frame, logging every second of deviation, every tilt, every heat spike. I compared it to the archived data from my original simulations. They matched within a 0.3% margin of error. My blueprint had been right. Not perfect, but right, and no one had read it. Peter went silent for 2 weeks. His name disappeared from the internal staff logs. The task force assigned to review Spectre X's failure began pulling in new experts, external, expensive, and desperate. Some of them I had read about, some I had trained with. All of them had less experience with the thermal regulation problem than I did. But I didn't reach out. I didn't try to claw my way back. I waited. And I listened. Because failure has a sound, it's not dramatic. It doesn't explode. It pulses like a second heartbeat. The same one I'd heard over a year ago. The Spectre X didn't crash, but it didn't fly either. And in a program like that, not flying is the same as falling. Behind closed doors, a message started to circulate. Not loudly, not publicly, but quietly among those who needed to know. The girl who wrote the original memo, the one flagged and dismissed, the one who had seen the heartbeat no one else could feel. Her name, Sloane Harper. That whisper reached ears it was never meant to, including one that mattered more than the rest. General Aldridge. He'd signed my removal from the system's audit list 2 years earlier. He hadn't even looked at the memo himself, just followed the summary review, approved the rotation, and moved on. Now he was the man being asked why the most expensive aircraft in recent memory couldn't last 20 minutes in the air. The request came from above. Find out what happened. Find out who knew and didn't say anything. That answer led him straight to a folder labeled Thermal Pulse Oscillation Risk Category Yellow, signed S. Harper. They erased me, but paper doesn't forget. And that signature was the first thing that made them remember. After the Spectre X failure at Fort Ravenshade, the program entered what the brass called Red Phase Reassessment. Internally, that meant chaos. Externally, it meant silence. They called in everyone. Literally 49 experts from different defense contractors, military research centers, and private aerospace think tanks. Some came with impressive titles: Chief Systems Architect, Lead Propulsion Engineer, Senior AI Flight Coordinator. Some had worked on stealth drones, others on 5th-gen jets. They replaced every major input module in the system. New sensors, new chipsets, new synchronization interfaces. The rotor programming was rewritten. The electrical routing was rebuilt from scratch. Entire thermal boards were swapped out and re-simulated in virtual sandboxes. And yet not one of them looked at the thermal harmonics. Not one of them questioned whether the failure was heat-related. I watched from a distance, reading between redacted summaries and vague procurement requests. I saw who was being flown in. I recognized names. I had trained with some, had outperformed a few. But no one called me. They called everyone except me. Not that I expected it. By then I had become something of a ghost within the system. A name you didn't bring up in meetings if you wanted the conversation to stay polite. I wasn't seen as wrong, just inconvenient. And yet I knew the truth. The Spectre X hadn't failed because of missing talent. It had failed because of arrogance. Because they built a machine that refused to listen to the person who knew its limits best. It wasn't a system error. It was a cultural one. And then someone did listen. Someone I least expected. General Aldridge. He had overseen dozens of failed programs in his career. He didn't panic easily, but when congressional pressure began mounting and foreign allies started pulling back on interest, the chain of command began looking for deeper answers. That's when Aldridge requested full access to Spectre X's project archives, unfiltered, unredacted, and complete with internal communications. Buried deep in the revision logs inside a folder dated February 2020 was a report flagged for theoretical concerns, closed. The document was 8 pages long. Charts, code snippets, thermal cycle diagnostics, and a memo header that read, Thermal Pulse Oscillation Risk Category Yellow, Author S. Harper, Status, Dismissed Reviewer G.H. Gregory Harper. The corner of the PDF had a digital annotation from a lower-level admin. 3 words, not urgent, archived. But Aldridge didn't skim it. He read the whole thing, twice. He didn't tell anyone what he was thinking, not yet. Instead, he pulled up my personnel file, saw the reassignment note, saw the recommendation line marked Theory Heavy, difficult integration. Recommend exclusion from Phase 2. And next to it, his own signature. He had approved my removal in 2021. He hadn't remembered. To him, I was just one of dozens of names cycled through the system. Until the failure made him read what I wrote. Until the silence forced him to listen. He didn't ask for permission. He didn't notify the review board. And he certainly didn't tell my father. He made one call. To me. I didn't recognize the number. Didn't answer the first time. But when it rang again, I picked up. His voice was steady. Low. Commanding, but not cold. Sloan Harper. Yes, this is General Aldridge. I'm calling to ask if you're still familiar with the Spectre X heat regulation model. There was a pause. A long one. He didn't fill it. He let it sit. I said I drafted the first version of it. He cleared his throat. I know. I read it. And I'm asking if you're willing to look at it again this time with full access. No restrictions. No politics. I asked the only question that mattered. Does my father know you're calling another pause? Shorter, sharper, no. And I'd prefer it stays that way, for now. His tone wasn't disrespectful. It was deliberate. And it told me everything I needed to hear. He was trying to fix what he had helped break. I didn't say yes right away. I didn't say no either. Instead, I asked for one thing. Send me the last 30 minutes of flight telemetry. Unedited. He did. Within the hour. A secure server link with a single file attached. I ran it through my old model, the one I'd kept refining in secret. And there it was. The same pulse, the same spike, the same flaw, the heartbeat. It had never gone away. They'd just layered enough tech over it to hide the sound, until the sound got loud enough to bring everything crashing down. I called him back the next morning. He didn't pick up. I left a single sentence in the voicemail. I'll do it, but I'm coming on my terms. He didn't ask what those terms were. He didn't need to, because this time they weren't going to rewrite me out of the blueprint. Not again. Not ever. The hangar felt colder than I expected. I'd forgotten how the polished concrete held the chill. The kind of cold that didn't freeze you, it observed you. Quiet, clinical. My boots echoed with every step I took. I wasn't wearing a uniform, but I still walked like I belonged. Years of training don't vanish just because your clearance code does. 50 faces turned toward me. Some familiar, some cautious, some curious, and one stone-faced, unreadable belonged to my father. General Gregory Harper didn't blink when I stepped in. He didn't flinch. He didn't look surprised. But he wasn't expecting me. I could tell by the way his jaw set. Not tight, not defensive, just firm, like a lock being tested. I stopped just inside the roped perimeter. A soldier stepped toward me, hesitating. He looked at my father, who nodded once. Escort her out. It wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. I didn't move. The soldier took a step closer. Sir, I said without raising my voice, I've been summoned. My father's eyes narrowed. You're not on the manifest. I held his stare. Said nothing. Let the silence work for me, just this once. And then the door at the far end of the hangar opened. Boots on concrete, not rushed, not loud, just final. General Aldridge entered without ceremony, flanked by no one. He walked straight toward us, nodding at no one, scanning nothing. He stopped 2 steps behind me, paused, and spoke like he was delivering a verdict. She drafted the blueprint. Every head turned, every breath caught. He stepped forward into view. His eyes met my father's. She leads now. I heard it before I saw it. Peter inhaling sharply, a quiet, involuntary intake of air. I looked at him. He didn't argue. He didn't nod. He just lowered his head like someone accepting something they couldn't change. One of the junior engineers near the back whispered, "Wait, she's the one." Another added, "I thought she got cut from the early team." No one answered, because no one was sure what they were allowed to say anymore. Aldridge turned to the gathered room. For the next 72 hours, all system access routes run through her. If she asks for it, she gets it. If she says stop, you stop. Then he turned back to me. You have full authority, no restrictions. I nodded. No salute. No thank you. Just a quiet agreement between two people who knew this wasn't about favors. It was about correction. I stepped past the rope, past the engineers, past Peter, and past my father. He didn't move, didn't speak, but I felt the weight of his silence like a vibration in my spine. I didn't need his words. I didn't want them. What I wanted was to fix what they had broken and what they had buried. I approached the Spectre X prototype. The tarps were still halfway drawn back. Its side panels gleamed under the hangar lights, but not like a polished machine, like something sweating under pressure. I ran my hand along the main access plate, warm, slightly misaligned. The heartbeat was still in there, waiting to be heard. I didn't ask for help, didn't assign tasks. I just opened my case, pulled out the tools I had brought, old one's familiar analog, a mechanical stethoscope, a portable vibration scanner, a temperature probe custom-built from parts I soldered myself. The engineers watched, some skeptical, some fascinated. I didn't explain, I didn't justify. I let the work speak first. Within minutes, I found the pulse, the micro vibrations still present, still rhythmic, amplifying under simulated load. I adjusted the dampener settings manually, not through software, through feel, because this machine wasn't a set of codes. It was a system with symptoms, and systems don't always respond to commands. Sometimes they respond to attention. I worked for 2 hours without pause. No one interrupted. Peter hovered nearby once, then stepped back. He didn't say anything. I think he knew better. Or maybe he finally saw. My father never came closer than 10 feet. He didn't leave, but he didn't step forward. He stood like a statue, the man who once wrote in my evaluation that I was too theoretical for execution, now watching me execute what no one else could even identify. I finished the adjustments, logged the data, closed the side panel, then turned to Aldridge, ready for test flight. He didn't smile. He just nodded. We launch at 600, and with that I stepped away. I didn't look back at my father. Didn't need to. He had already seen everything he needed to. The woman he tried to erase was now the only one left standing. And for the first time in years, I wasn't chasing a seat at the table. I had become the one setting it. I returned to the hangar the next morning before sunrise. The world was still gray outside, and inside the lights hadn't fully warmed up yet. It made the place feel more honest, less ceremonial, more like the space I remembered from before everything was taken from me. No one else was there yet. That was intentional. I needed time, not with people, with the machine. Spectre X sat like a grounded beast, all power and potential, silent and still. No one had touched it since I closed the panel the night before. The room around it remained as I'd left it, tool carts pushed to the side. Data pads, powered down cables, coiled but ready. I unzipped my bag and pulled out my own instruments. Not military issue, not contractor approved. Tools I had built, modified, and calibrated by hand over the last 2 years. A portable infrared sensor rig, a mechanical stethoscope with vibration plates retuned to detect thermal resonance, and a paper notebook. No screens, no autocorrection, no syncing. Just ink margin notes and margins that I filled the way other people fill silence with purpose. I attached the IR rig, first setting 3 contact points along the engine's thermal isolation sheath. The diagnostics they had run before those 50 specialists from 5 different defense labs, they all started and ended with digital input. But you can't hear a machine through a screen. You have to listen, and machines don't lie. They just whisper. I activated the stethoscope, pressed it against the lower core panel, and closed my eyes. And there it was, the heartbeat. Faint, intermittent, but real. A low-frequency tremor cycling every 11.4 seconds under resting conditions. I wrote it down. Next, I triggered a simulated load increase thermal, not torque. A forced buildup in heat meant to replicate 15 minutes of flight without actual ignition. At the 13-minute mark, the pulses changed, not in volume, in rhythm. They went from consistent to fractured like a skipped beat trying to find its way back. This was what caused the system failure. It wasn't a glitch. It was a pattern, a response to pressure that no digital model had been able to sustain. I took a deep breath and opened my notebook to the blueprint I had drawn over a year ago. The lines were still clean. The layout was still elegant. But it needed one change. There I circled the dampener module, then redrew the positioning, shifted it 2.7 centimeters westward in the frame alignment, adjusted the material callout, replacing a composite-grade coupling with an elastic alloy blend I had tested myself in off-grid labs. Then I flipped the page and diagrammed the change in airflow from the heat exhaust junction. That was where the feedback loop started to misfire, not because of design flaws, but because of rigid assumptions. No one ever challenged the original placement because they thought the AI optimizations were superior. But optimization isn't the same as intuition. And intuition told me that heat doesn't just flow. It dances. And this design had been fighting the rhythm since day one. By the time the tech crew arrived, I had already finished my sketches, finalized the modifications, and submitted a requisition for a custom fabricated damper plate. They didn't question it, didn't try to slow me down. Peter stood in the corner for most of the day, quiet, occasionally checking his tablet, but mostly watching. I didn't ask why. I didn't need to. I knew what he was thinking. Knew that somewhere in that calculated, polished mind of his, a part was starting to realize I hadn't been wrong. I had just been invisible. I worked for 10 hours straight, barely stopped to drink water, never sat down. By nightfall, the Spectre X's core had been recalibrated. The heartbeat had been reduced to a hum not gone, but controlled, manageable, heard. Machines don't want perfection. They want balance. And I had finally given this one space to breathe. I made one last note in my journal before closing it. I wrote the blueprint, but they never read it with real eyes. That line had been repeating in my head for days, maybe longer. It wasn't bitterness. It wasn't pride. It was just the truth. Because reading a blueprint isn't about seeing lines on a page. It's about recognizing the mind behind it. The warnings built into every angle. The years of experience layered beneath each measurement. They hadn't just ignored me. They had ignored the story the machine was trying to tell. And it almost cost them everything. At 2100 hours, I closed the access panel and stood back. Spectre X didn't move, didn't roar, didn't ignite, but it felt different, steady, centered, like a patient whose fever had broken. I knew we'd test it the next morning, knew that others would still doubt until they saw the results themselves. But I didn't need proof anymore. I had heard the engine's voice, had answered, had been the one to listen when no one else would. And that more than recognition, more than redemption was enough. Machines remember, not in memory banks, but in rhythm, and that rhythm. It had finally returned to peace, because I'd listened long enough to hear what it had been trying to say all along. At Aero 900 hours, we gathered on the second observation deck. From this height, you could see the entire test range stretched across the salt flats like a white canvas. Clear skies. Still air, no excuses. The Spectre X had been wheeled into position at dawn, polished, reset, waiting. Everyone was here again. Engineers, military brass, foreign observers in Navy suits. The difference this time was that I wasn't just watching. I was the one who signed off on the final calibration. I was the one who checked the telemetry node, the vent seals, the new damper plate. I was the one who rewrote the protocol for thermal drift. I wasn't a guest. I was the reason we were even standing here. Peter was in the front row, head down. General Aldridge stood beside him, arms folded, eyes steady on the horizon. And my father, Colonel Gregory Harper, stood on the far right side of the room. Not at the center, not in command. He hadn't said a word to me all morning. I stood in the back, didn't need to be seen. Only needed the machine to speak now. At Loro 911, Spectre X lifted clean from the ground. No sputter, no flame burp, no tremor. At Loro 912, it banked into a vertical climb, held it at 17,000 feet, then dropped and adjusted its axis at a 42-degree incline. That had been one of my additions. I knew it would happen. At 0921, it hovered mid-air for 60 seconds, then transitioned into lateral flight, gliding across the flats like a predator in absolute control. At 0932, it returned, landed as if it had never failed. Silence for 2 seconds. Then applause. Not polite applause. Not staged. Not the kind where people clap because they're expected to. This was thunder, genuine, startled, exuberant. Some engineers actually shouted. I heard one man say, "That's not possible." Another whispered, "She fixed it in 1 day." I didn't turn around. Didn't smile. I just looked straight ahead at the helicopter, now standing proud, the same one they had nearly buried 6 times, with wrong diagnostics and louder voices. My eyes scanned the room. Aldridge clapped. Peter did too. Hesitantly, but it counted. But my father. He didn't move. No applause. No visible reaction. Just stillness. He didn't sit down. Didn't exit. Didn't even glance in my direction. He looked at the floor like it was suddenly foreign. And for the first time in my life, I wondered, was he remembering the memo? The line that said I was too theoretical, that I didn't fit? Or was he staring into the fact that the blueprint he'd once called over-designed was the one now holding that aircraft together? I'll never know what was running through his mind. But I know what wasn't there. Pride, joy, relief. No. What I saw in his face was something colder. Discomfort. The kind of discomfort truth brings when it's undeniable. Not because it's harsh, but because it's not on your terms. Because it stares you in the face and says, you were wrong. And someone else didn't need your permission to be right. I didn't need his clap. I didn't need his praise. I had the proof. Hovering, landing, flying. And in that silence between his breath and the applause of everyone else, I realized something important. I had always believed I needed his recognition to feel real. But in that moment, surrounded by engineers who once dismissed me by a machine that only worked because I had listened, I didn't need anyone's recognition. Just results, just rhythm, just truth, and the truth. It didn't need applause. It just needed to fly. The debrief was held 3 hours after the successful flight. Windowless room, white walls, no recordings. 20 people sat around a U-shaped table. All were men except me. All wore rank or reputation except me. Peter sat 2 seats to my left, scribbling on a notepad, but never raising his eyes. My father wasn't there. I didn't ask why. General Aldridge entered last, took his seat at the head, and gave a slow nod. He didn't speak right away. He let the silence do what silence does, pressure everyone into honesty. Then from the far end of the table, someone finally broke. A senior systems engineer I'd seen a dozen times but never heard speak. He cleared his throat, looked toward Aldridge, then me, then Peter. So he said, voice even. She was right all along. The question floated for a second. No one rushed to answer, because everyone in that room already knew the truth. I didn't say anything. I wasn't going to argue for a truth already proven. Peter didn't speak either. He shifted in his seat. Then slowly, quietly, nodded. It wasn't dramatic, but it was clear. Someone else, a policy official from NATO oversight, asked the next question less calmly. If the memo had been reviewed back in 2020, would this crisis have happened at all? Still silence. I looked down at my own copy of that memo. Slightly torn at the corner, faded ink. My initials in red. Dismissed. Nobody wanted to say it out loud. Yes. Yes, the failure could have been prevented. Yes, the cost millions of dollars and international embarrassment was avoidable. Yes, I had been right from the start. But no one said it. They just shifted, fidgeted, looked at papers that weren't relevant. Then Aldrich finally leaned forward. He didn't clear his throat, didn't raise his voice. He just said that memo passed through my office in late 2020. I didn't act. I didn't ask questions. That's on me. The room stilled again. Someone tried to interrupt to deflect, but Aldrich held up his hand. I take responsibility, he repeated. Blame doesn't interest me. Correction does. I respected him more in that moment than I ever had before. Not because he defended me, but because he didn't defend himself. There was nothing more to say. The room didn't erupt into apologies. No one got emotional. But things shifted quietly, permanently. That's the thing about truth. It doesn't always win arguments, but it lingers, it changes posture, it stains silence. I walked out without waiting for closing remarks. No one stopped me, but one man did follow me to the door. Peter, he didn't say anything, just placed something in my hand, a small flash drive. Your original code, I found it on the server, he said. Then he left. No explanation, no justification. Just the weight of a quiet admission. For some, that day was a disaster averted. For me, it was the day I stopped asking for permission to be right. 3 weeks later, my name was printed legally publicly, and finally in the official Spectre X design archive. It sat on page 1 of the revised technical documentation filed under Primary Systems Architecture Thermal Dynamics Division. Under it, in clean bold type, lead engineer Sloan Harper. I stared at the PDF file for 10 full minutes the first time I opened it. Not because I didn't believe it, but because it felt quiet. Not triumphant, not vindictive, just steady. The kind of quiet that follows a storm, where everything's still standing, but now the structure finally reflects the truth. That morning, I received a call from the Office of Military Technology Certification. They were uploading the revised documents to the Pentagon's internal system. My authorship would now be tied by protocol to every upgrade derived from Spectre X moving forward. They used the word retroactive. I preferred restorative. A week later, I stood beside General Aldrich as he signed the final authorization. He didn't make a speech, just passed me the pen after signing. I didn't need to sign anything, but he wanted me to hold the pen anyway. After a moment, he said, "Late, but this time, right." His voice was even, no dramatics, just acknowledgement. I appreciated that more than applause. Later that day, I was called into a smaller room. No press, no officials, just 3 men from the Department of Defense Records and Recognition Office. They had one purpose: to reinsert my name into the record as the project's founding system architect. They asked if I had any objections to the phrasing. I read their proposed sentence, Spectre X Thermal Stabilization Protocol, initially drafted and recommended by S. Harper in November 2020. I nodded, but added one word: bold it. The lead officer blinked. "Excuse me, make that line bold," I said. "Not louder, just firmer." He clicked. Bolded, saved, done. The Pentagon keeps a physical archive of high-level defense projects. It's a quiet, temperature-controlled hallway, stainless steel filing racks behind bulletproof glass. Most people walk past it without thinking, but I knew where the Spectre X file was now housed. I visited it 2 days later, not because I needed proof, but because I needed to see it. There it was, 3rd row, 6th file from the left. My name. Not an asterisk, not a footnote, not an afterthought. I rested my fingers on the glass, felt nothing but cold through the surface. Still, I whispered to myself, they finally saw it. Not because I shouted, but because the engine did. And that, for me, was enough. That night, I received an encrypted message from a younger engineer who had once dismissed my memo without reading. It said, "You were 10 years ahead. I was 10 years late." "I'm sorry," I didn't reply. Not out of anger, but because sometimes silence isn't the absence of sound. It's the presence of peace. Peter and I met once more outside protocol, at a small aviation museum where our mother used to take us when we were teenagers. We didn't talk about the project, didn't talk about the press. He handed me a book, our stepmother's old field manual, annotated with notes from when she was writing her thesis on atmospheric control systems. Inside was a sticky note: Sloan, you didn't just belong. You were the blueprint. Evelyn, I closed the book gently. Maybe that was the only recognition I ever truly needed. And now I had both, one in ink, one in memory, and I knew for the first time in a long time I could build again, this time not in silence. When they offered me a permanent seat on the Spectre X development board, I didn't hesitate. I declined, respectfully, clearly, without a second of doubt. I had done what I came to do: restore the system, correct the record, leave no question of who built its bones. But returning to that system, one that had once erased me, felt like pressing rewind on a life I no longer wanted. I didn't want applause. I wanted momentum. And I wanted to build something that couldn't be dismantled by ego or protocol. 6 months later, in a quiet industrial district just outside Fort Worth, I unlocked the doors to the Harper Initiative. Not a base, not a lab, not a think tank, but an academy, specifically for young women with an interest in systems engineering, aerospace design, and robotics. With one admission requirement: you had to be the daughter of a U.S. veteran. I didn't advertise it, didn't hold a press conference, just opened the doors and waited. They came, not in droves, not with polished resumes, but with notebooks full of sketches, hands that smelled like soldering flux, eyes that burned with questions no one had ever encouraged them to ask. I knew those eyes. They were mine 15 years ago, standing in a garage with parts stolen from lawnmowers and old radios, begging anyone to let me build. Now I was that someone. We started with 12, then 28. By month 5, there were 43 girls, some from military families who'd moved every year, some who had never touched a circuit board before. We partnered with a private aerospace lab that donated old engine models. A retired lieutenant colonel funded our thermal simulation station, and an anonymous donor, later revealed to be General Aldrich, paid for the 3D printers. We didn't teach for exams. We taught for curiosity. My favorite sign in the lab read, "Reverse engineer the question, not just the answer." We hung it right above the whiteboard. I declined 3 speaking invitations that year, all from organizations that had once ignored my research. I didn't do bitterness, but I also didn't do branding. Our work didn't need spotlight. It needed stability. One Wednesday morning in early fall, a package arrived. No return address, no markings except a single name in black ink: S. Harper. Inside was a box lacquered wood, military style, old but polished, its latch still intact. And inside it, wrapped in archival paper, was a photo. Me, age 7, covered in grease, holding a remote-controlled plane I'd built from spare metal strips. Next to me, stone-faced, stood my father, not smiling, but not leaving either. On the back of the photo, scribbled in black pen, I didn't know how to say it then. Beneath it was another item, a blueprint. My blueprint, the original thermal schematic. But this one was different. His handwriting filled the margins. Corrections, comments, not critiques, questions. Why did you place the coils this far apart? Could this spacing increase airflow stability? What if we integrate a dual-core sensor here at the very bottom in cleaner script? I read it now. Thank you for writing it. I sat with the box for nearly an hour. Didn't cry, didn't call, just sat. My hands rested on the wood, not to hold on, but to let go. That weekend, I pinned the blueprint inside our academy's entryway. No frame, no signature plaque, just paper, proof. Every girl who walked through those doors could see it. They didn't ask who had written it or who had finally read it, because they were too busy building their own, and that to me meant it was exactly where it needed to be. The letter wasn't sealed. It lay at the bottom of the wooden box, tucked neatly beneath the photograph and the blueprint. Folded twice, written in blue ink. No salutation, no signature, but I knew the handwriting. I had seen it on every corrected draft he ever returned to me without a word. Precise, sharp, unsentimental. My fingers trembled, but not from nerves, more like recognition. The way you feel when something returns to you after being gone too long and you're not sure if you still want it. I unfolded the paper. I was wrong. About the blueprint, about you. Just those 3 lines stopped me. He continued. It was never about being tough. I told myself it was. I told myself I was teaching you discipline. But it wasn't that. It was about being right. About me needing to be right. I kept reading. I read your memo. Not because someone made me. I found it in an old file, almost deleted. Your handwriting was smaller then. Your calculations weren't. There was a smudge after that line. Maybe a pause. Maybe something unsaid. You saw what none of us did. And when I watched that thing fly, I didn't clap. Not because I wasn't proud, but because pride and shame don't fit in the same chest at once. You warned us. We dismissed you. He didn't try to justify it. Didn't mention Peter. Didn't talk about Evelyn. Didn't bring up the years in between. Just one final line. I don't know if this counts for anything now, but I see it. All of it. And I'm sorry. That was it. Not signed. Not dated. But I knew the year. And I knew it took him all of it to write that. I folded the letter back deliberately, gently. Edges aligned. Ink pressed in place. I didn't cry. Didn't shake. Didn't whisper anything back to it. Instead, I placed it beside the blueprint. The one they once said was too theoretical, too cautious, too much her. The edges were worn now, yellowed from sunlight, curled from humidity, but it still held. Like I did. There was no reply to send, no phone call to make, because I didn't need to prove anything anymore. I had already built something far beyond apology. A legacy not grounded in correction, but creation. For years I had carried the weight of not being chosen, of being brilliant but invisible, precise but doubted, present but erased. Now the silence that once drowned me had become my strength. In that quiet, I listened. I listened to data, to patterns, to instinct, and eventually to myself. My father once said, "Don't be impressive, be correct." I spent years trying to meet that mark, until I realized it wasn't about being correct for him. It was about being complete for myself. The system I designed flew, not because they believed me, but because I never stopped believing the numbers, the model, the rhythm, and yes, my own mind. So I didn't send the letter back, didn't write one in return. Instead, I made room for it, on a shelf. Next to the prototype turbine, a student and I had built from scrap aluminum. No plaque, no glass box, just memory. And motion, I teach now. But more than that, I witness. I witness brilliance in the hands of girls who once thought maybe was the best they could hope for. Now they say definitely. Now they write their own specs. Now no one can erase their names from the blueprints. Not even their fathers. And me, I still walk the halls of the Harper Initiative with a tool belt on my waist and a flash drive in my pocket. I still adjust the pressure valve with my own hand when the pump hisses. Still show the new recruits how to listen, truly listen to what a machine is trying to say. Because every sound holds a story. Mine just happened to end with a flight, a letter, and a silence that no longer hurt. I'm not waiting anymore, not for applause, not for closure, not for someone else's version of recognition. I have bigger plans now. And this time, no one gets to erase my name from the blueprint. Before we say goodbye, we'd love to know, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with a warm cup of coffee, or a late night where stories like this keep you company? Let us know in the comments. We read everyone with gratitude. And if this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing to the channel. Not just to hear more stories like this, but to be part of a community that still believes in kindness, healing, and second chances. Thank you for spending your time with us today. Wherever you are, we hope you carry this story with you, and remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're ready to open your heart. Take care, and we'll see you in the next story.